career, long career at Goshen College, starting out as a classroom teacher, as a professor of sociology, and then he was asked to become associate academic dean, and after that, quite a number of years as director of international education. And the directors need to go and find host families and choose professors to lecture. It's quite a demanding task in many parts of the world. I asked him a little bit about his Iowa identity. He and his wife, Julie, live in a nice condo in Iowa City, but she has two siblings with farms. And Tom said he likes spending time in nature, but he didn't say anything about riding those big green tractors that are on those farms. He is also a volunteer guide at the Kelowna Mennonite Museum, and he continues to study Amish culture, and he'll be presenting a paper in 2 weeks at Elizabethtown College. Welcome, Tom, and we look forward to your theme.
Thank you. Thank you, Vic. It's great to be with you, to be vicariously back in Goshen. I miss the people of Goshen a great deal, but Iowa City has been good. It's been a very good place to live. Julie and I have a lovely home, and life has been good here. My assignment was to look at the Pew data that was released last fall about religion in America. My question on the screen that I will come to at the end is, are we moving towards a post-Christian America? There are a couple of ways we can approach that question, but we'll get to it later. I want to begin with some comments about the experience of what I'm calling religious cognitive dissonance that I've experienced in life. I'm experiencing it right now with the dissonance between the Christianity that I know, that I grew up with, that I learned throughout a lifetime as a Mennonite, and the religious experience of the right, of what you talked about last week as Christian nationalism, how to bring those two together. I've had experiences like this in the past. I think when I think about college, I think about learning to know David Shank. David Shank, as you know, was a missionary in Belgium and was called to Goshen College after he came back from Belgium to be campus pastor. And in those early 70s years, he talked a lot about his experience in Europe, and particularly said that at that time, in his mind, Europe was post-Christian. And as a young person, I had always assumed that, well, the West, Europe, North America are all Christian. And he said, no, many people there already at that point had left Christianity aside and said that we are post-Enlightenment people who don't need religion anymore. And that caused a kind of dissonance in my mind. Later, when I went to graduate school at Boston University, was the first time I encountered people who were genuinely hostile to religion. People in my graduate program thought religion was tradition, pre-scientific, pre-enlightenment. At its worst, it was the opiate of the people, using a Marxist framework. So again, my religious experience and the people I was encountering, there was a clash. Before I met Julie, I was in a relationship with a French woman for about 10 years. And I remember the first time very vividly, she learned that I was a Christian and I was part of this strange little group called the Mennonites. She got this funny look on her face. How could someone who has a PhD believe in Christianity? That just boggled her mind. She would ask me periodically questions that challenged me, like when the tsunami hit Western Indonesia, hit the island of Aceh, and thousands of people died, horrific deaths. She would ask me, where is your God in all this? So I experienced this tension, and I'm experiencing it now as I think of my understanding of Christianity and the Christian right's understanding of Christianity, and there's a real clash there. Okay, let's look at the Pew data. First of all, who is Pew? Why should we listen to them? Well, if you watch public television, you'll often hear the reference to the Pew Charitable Trust that funds a lot of the programming on public television. They are a nonpartisan think tank. They generate all kinds of data. Their mission is to enrich the public dialogue on all kinds of issues. They value independence, objectivity, etc. They do polls, they do surveys, they interview people on all kinds of issues. Every 10 years, they do a major study of the religious landscape of this country. They did one in 2007. They did one in 2014. There's one that will come in a few years. However, last fall, they released their findings based on data collected in 2021 about religious practice and experience in this country. And that's what I want to talk about for a few minutes. Their major finding, of course, is not surprising, that religion is on the decline in this country. Let me get rid of my image here. In 2007, 78%, a majority of the US described themselves as Christian. By 2021, that number fell to 63%. And what's really interesting is that roughly a third, 30% of people in this country describe themselves as religious nuns. Not N-U-N, but N-O-N-E-S, nuns, people who either characterize themselves as atheists, agnostics, or nothing in particular, which means when you ask, what is your religious identity? They simply say nothing in particular. So in 2007, 15 years ago, the ratio of Christians to religious none was 5-1. By 2021, it was 2-1. We have a significant portion of our population who do not subscribe to any religious belief at this point in history. Who are these nuns? Well, they divide them into the categories of atheist, agnostic, and nothing in particular, which means when you ask, what is your religious identity? They say, I have no identity as a religious person. So the number of nuns continues to grow. Well, what about world religions in the US? Has that been changing? Not really. There's a slight increase in the number of people who are part of major world religions like Judaism, Islam, etc. This term religious nuns is ambiguous. There are people who say, I have no formal religious belief, no formal religion rather, and yet I believe in God. Are they really nuns in the same way as someone who has no belief? There are nuns, religious nuns, who are cultural Christians. That is, they attend Christmas, Easter services, participate in religious rituals, but they don't call themselves Christians. My impression is that we have a large number of young Mennonites who are cultural Mennonites. They like to sing hymns, they like to gather together with other Mennonites, but claim no particular religious belief. That is not unusual in this country. I'm going to refer to another study that appeared just recently, which looks at the different generations that exist in our country at this point on this question of religion and religious faith. We've known for a long time that childhood experience leads to adult experience. Those, as the quote here says, who've had robust religious experiences as children tend to maintain those beliefs, practices in adulthood, whereas those who have relatively little in the way of actual experience with religion as children do not tend to be religious adherents as adults. So in this study, they broke down generations using these categories. Most of you in this room are part of the silent generation, people born before 1945. Baby boomers are people born from 46 to 64, Gen X 65 to 80, millennials 81 to 96, and most recently Gen Zs 97 to 2012. Well, it's this Gen Z group that has the least amount of regular participation in religious services, are least likely to do things like say grace before a meal, etc. A majority of those of us who are baby boomers experienced religious services, experienced religious practice. Gen Zs are much less likely to say, I went to church as a child, or I go to church now. And there are other indicators of how this practice and belief is declining by generation. The percentage of each generation who are religiously unaffiliated keeps growing. Silent generation, 9% are religiously unaffiliated. And you can see the increase as we get up to the most recent group, Gen Zs. 34% of those people say they're religiously unaffiliated. Well, Pew has done comparative research between the US and Europe. They have lots of data about the decline in practice in Europe as well as the US. There's some interesting data to look at. This table's a little complicated. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. The red column are Christians. The grayish column on the right are religiously unaffiliated. So believers on the left, people who are unaffiliated on the right. Some very interesting things. Among Christians in Europe, only 14% say religion is very important in their lives. 68% of Christians in this country say that religion is very important in their lives. Christians in Europe, about a third have gone to church in the last, or go to church monthly, 2/3 in this country. 18% of European Christians say they pray daily versus 68% in this country. Believe in God with absolute certainty, 23% of Christians in Europe, 76% in the US. The right-hand side, there's some real dissonance here again. People who are religiously unaffiliated, 13% of the people who are religiously unaffiliated in the US say religion is important in their lives versus 1% in Europe. 9% of the people who are religiously unaffiliated go to church at least once a month. 20% pray daily. 27% religiously unaffiliated, believe in God with absolute certainty. Well, there is a difference clearly between the US and Europe in both of these categories of Christian and religiously unaffiliated. Well, atheism, this whole idea is also problematic. If religious nuns is problematic in terms of a precise definition, so is atheism. A large number of Europeans are cultural Christians. That is, they self-identify as Christians, but they may have no belief in anything beyond this earth. Sweden is a country of 9 million people. 60% of Swedes are members of a church. However, only 20% say they actually believe in God, and only 16% believe in a personal God. We might conclude that Sweden is 80% atheist, but only 15% of themselves call themselves atheists. So these terms are problematic because of the way people understand them. Belief and practice don't always coincide. Well, what about specific religious practice in the US? In 2007, nearly 6 in 10 Americans prayed daily. That number has dropped to 45%. In 2007, 18% of the people in this country say they seldom or never pray. And now roughly a third say they seldom or never pray. For some reason, the Pew data does not include religious practice or attending religious services going back a long time. They have recent data, and they show that in a very short period of time, there's been a decline from 2020 to 2021 in actual attendance in church. The most recent number is 53% of Americans say they seldom or never go to church. What about subgroups? When you break down Christians into subgroups, here are the numbers. Among Protestants, looking at people who attend church, 40% go at least once a week. But if you break that down racially, and more importantly, if you break it into the subgroups of evangelical and non-evangelical, they define evangelical as somebody who self-describes as having a born-again experience. So, among those who attend church at least once a week, 40% of Protestants say that's true. Among white Protestants, 35%. If you look down among Black Protestants, 49%. Among evangelicals, about half go to church once a week. The non-evangelicals, about 1 in 5 go to church every week. There's not a lot of difference between white and Latino Catholics, but about 1/4 of Catholics attend church once a week. This weekly attendance number is interesting when you combine all races. The majority of evangelicals are going to church, but clearly a minority of non-evangelicals are going to church. The evangelical group is the one group that's bucking this trend towards decline in religious belief and practice. And I'm convinced that this growth in evangelical belief and practice is linked to Christian nationalism that you talked about last week. This evangelical wing of Christianity has been one of the strongest supporters of right-wing politics, in particular Donald Trump. In the Pew Report, they suggest that white evangelicals voted for Trump in larger numbers in 2020 than he did in 2016. I'm told that this sign is appearing everywhere. Jesus is my savior, Trump is my president. In a nutshell, that's what Christian nationalism is all about. Someone told me recently that there's a sign of this kind on the edge of Bourbon on Route 6. Well, there are some who argue that being evangelical Christian is synonymous with being Republican. An article that I found very helpful in thinking about the linkage between right-wing Christian nationalism and Christianity was an article that appeared in The Atlantic last fall, the October 24 issue. Peter Weiner published this piece called "The Evangelical Church is Breaking Apart," and I like the, after the colon, "Christians must reclaim Jesus from his church." Many Christians, this author argues, have embraced the worst aspects of our culture and our politics. Christian faith has become politicized. It becomes a place where people air their grievances, where tribal identities are reinforced, where fears are nurtured, where nastiness, as he says, becomes sacralized. Historian George Marsden has written extensively about civil religion, and he argues that what we're seeing is the latest rendition of civil religion emerging in this country. But this form of civil religion has become particularly nasty. It has opened Christians to hatred, to resentments, to tribal instincts. The gospel of many of these people is a gospel of hatred, resentment, vilifications, put down, insults, etc. A Yale sociologist calls this a secular form of religious nationalism. By religious nationalism, I mean one that strips religious identity of its ethical content its transcendental reference. Religion serves mainly as an ethnicity, as a marker of ethnicity. And then he goes on to say how religion has been used in the past to justify all kinds of nasty tribal identity versus the other, beginning with native people, going on from there. There has been this long history of the use of religion for nefarious purposes, for bloody conflict, for violent means and ends. Well, where is this set of ideas coming from? I grew up with the notion of catechism as religious instruction. In fact, when I was baptized at the church in Doylestown in eastern Pennsylvania, we were part of a catechism class. And catechism was the place where we learned the doctrines, the theology of the church. Well, what is the source of catechism for this new group of religious right Christians? A person by the name of Alan Jacobs at Baylor suggests the catechism source is public or social media, television, radio, Facebook, Twitter, podcasts, all these places where people derive information are the places where people get their religious teaching. When people's values are shaped by the media they consume rather than by their religious leaders and community, that has consequences. What all those media want is engagement, and engagement is most reliably driven by anger and hatred. They make bank when we hate each other. And so that hatred migrates into the church, which doesn't have resources to resist it. The real miracle here is that even so, in the mercy of God, many people do find their way to places of real love of God and neighbor. Politics and religion have fused, have become an identity that's connected. There's a quote here from a pastor in a Presbyterian church. He's heard of many congregants leaving their church because it didn't match their politics, but never once heard of someone changing their politics because it didn't match their church's teaching. Well, in the Atlantic article, Weiner asks two important questions. How many people look at churches in America these days and see the face of Jesus? Too often, I fear when Americans look at the church, they see not the face of Jesus, but the style of Donald Trump. And they see a lot of nastiness. Well, he ends his article with this list of things that are associated with Christian nationalism. I'm assuming you talked about them last week. The popular book by the prof from Calvin about patriarchy has to be preserved. There are all kinds of other hot button issues that are part of the religious right. They are tests of this ethnic religious identity. So if you're part of this group, you question the legitimacy of the 2020 election, you are not troubled by the January 6th insurrection, and the list goes on, including critical race theory, matters related to the pandemic, such as masks, vaccinations, etc. Mark Knoll is another person who's written about this issue. He's published a book called The Scandal of the Evangelical Mind. And he warns that in the coming years, these issues are going to be even more prominent. Vaccinations, evolutionary science, global warming are all going to be issues that get played out in this battleground between the religious right and people who are not on the religious right. That article in the Atlantic ends with, Jesus now has to be reclaimed from his church, from those who pretend to speak most authoritatively in his name. Too many Christians have domesticated Jesus by their resistance to be called to his call to radically rethink our attitudes toward power, ourselves, and others. We live in an era of acute anxiety and great fear. As a result, Christians end up wrapping Jesus into our angry and fearful distortions. We want Jesus to validate everything we believe, often as if he never walked on the face of the earth. What we're witnessing can be explained more by sociology than Christology. Well, then there's more here. I don't think I'll read these long quotes that make the same point, that religion has been wrapped up with right-wing ideology, and the religion that's part of some people's experience is a long way away from the gospel of Jesus. I have quotes from a Yale sociologist here. Again, it sort of repeats some of the things I've been saying, so I think I'll go on to my last points. I think we can argue that we may be headed towards a post-Christian America if we're not there already. Yes, there's a decline in belief and practice. The Pew data demonstrates that. But there also is a movement toward a form of Christianity that's far removed from the gospel of Jesus. When you take these two together, the decline in religious practice and this form of Christianity that doesn't conform to the gospel, then perhaps we are moving towards a post-Christian era. I'll stop there and let you all join in.
If you want to read the entire Pew study on religion, you can Google that. And if you do that, you'll be so impressed with what Tom has done to summarize and pull together what Dan Kaufman used to call the congealed essence of things, and made it much more accessible for us to understand and to respond. So are there questions? I think we have enough folk here that I should repeat them so everybody can understand the question. Questions for Tom? Yes.
Why is it that these Christians today would be impressed with Trump, who never seems to pray or know anything about Christianity?
And Hirschberger is asking.
He's a total out of it. He would not be someone I would expect them to follow. Someone like previous presidents, both of the Bush presidents, expressed something of a belief system, but not Trump.
And Hirschberger is asking, what is the attraction to Trump, who has so few religious beliefs or practices? In fact, as I recall the news, I think he went golfing on Easter Sunday morning, and has also exhibited some behaviors that are pretty far from traditional Christianity. So Tom, what is the big attraction here?
Well, I talked about dissonance. I mean, this is one of the biggest forms of dissonance. Why it's hard to explain why people who are Christian and have certain commitments about ethics can put aside a person's obviously unethical behavior and say, well, that's okay, as long as he is the president who takes care of the country and keeps those people out, etc., we will excuse his awful behavior. There's a dissonance there that I can't explain.
Thank you. Other questions? Yes.
To a question about methodology. How did Pew select the people to survey? Was it a broad section of Americans, which would include Jews and Hindus and so on? What about those other religions? Is there a faith in decline also? And again, who did they measure?
They do random surveys of people across the whole country. When they do the big national religious survey, they randomly select 35,000 people. It's a huge survey. And yes, they do the sort of standard, careful, methodological portioning out of people. They do not spend a lot of time looking at other world religion. The one slide I showed you, they do have some data among non-Christian or other than Christian people to suggest that there's a slight increase, but that's the only data that I have looked at about other world religions. But to answer your question, yes, they are very careful in their methodology.
Your question was about the methodology in terms of sample, who sampled, sample size, and the like. Did you have a follow-up?
I didn't just ask white Christians.
No. They have Latinos, they have African Americans, they have all kinds of categories of people in their data.
Yes, John Bender.
Tom, what gives you hope for a new authenticity of religious faith?
John Bender, who has spent quite a bit of time in England recently, is asking for your hope on a resurgence of true religious faith.
That's a hard question. I think there's a sizable number of young people who are committed to making the world a better place. Now, they're not always Christian, I'll confess that. But the issue of climate change in particular, there's a kind of passion among young people to do something about that, to change this awful situation we're in. I continue to find hope when I see young people with passion to do something about critical issues we're facing. Now, they're not always Christian, I'll admit that.
Tom, I want to ask a question a little similar to that. Some of the evangelical leaders, who I would consider to be truly Christian, see a relationship between the decline of young people wanting to be affiliated and some of this radical right-wing nationalism. Do you think there's something there?
Yeah, although there is some evidence that young evangelicals are going to church more and participating more than non-evangelical young Christians. Yeah, I think there is a portion of the young population who has been turned off by the religion of their parents, in particular, the marriage of religion and politics. And religion that doesn't address the key issues of the day. If religion doesn't speak to the things that I am most concerned about, then as a young person, why would I spend a lot of time with it?
Yes, John, Jordan.
Tom, is there any are there any data available on the influence of Christian nationalism in Mennonite and Anabaptist denominations in the U.S.?
John Jordan is asking, what is the data on the impact of white Christian nationalism on the Mennonite church?
I don't think we have that data. I'd like to know. I just read yesterday the letter that Guyton, the head of the Mennonite church, wrote about race. Have you read that?
Yes.
And the comments that he puts in the letter that he's received from people that sound pretty much like Christian nationalists. They're saying, why are you spending so much time talking about race? Race, you're being politically correct. There are some really nasty things that he's received in his mail from Mennonites. That is not representative data, but to me, it suggests there is there is a portion of Mennonites who are subscribing to that. I must confess that living in Iowa, the most the single most disturbing, surprising thing to me is that I know of 2 churches here, Mennonite churches, where people bring guns to church. I've never heard of such thing. And talk about dissonance. Mennonites with guns in church. I don't know how to describe that, except that people have left the fundamental understanding of what it means to be a Mennonite when they walk into church with a gun.
Last Sunday, Drew Strait mentioned the dilemma of a Mennonite pastor who indeed had a fairly sizable fraction of white nationalists. And the dilemma he felt is that if I push those folks too hard, too fast, they'll go to an even more radically white nationalist church and not a Mennonite church. So this is a tough time to be a pastor.
Yeah.
Other questions for Tom or comments? Yes, John Yoder.
Tom, you pointed out the influence of social media on creating Christian nationalism, and yet my discussions with Amish in this community and other places, they aren't on social media, and yet they're just as big Trump supporters as the rest of a lot of others. And my understanding is it's basically because he's against abortion. That trumps everything else. What is your understanding of the Amish situation?
Go ahead, repeat it.
I would like to repeat John's question to Tom, and that is he is alluding to Tom's claim that a lot of people are catechized by social media, and yet a number of Amish folks seem to have those same white nationalist attitudes, and they are not as known to be big consumers of social media. So how does this happen to take shape in Amish society? I'm glad we have an Amish scholar to answer that.
Well, yeah, it's true that abortion is a big issue for many Amish people, that they're very much opposed to abortion. I don't think that it's true that Amish people do not have access to this right-wing media. They work alongside people in industry who receive that kind of stuff all the time. They're in reading newspapers, which include that kind of thing. They get print material, which includes this kind of right-wing stuff. I don't think they're as isolated from this agenda as we might think.
There's been a study of Amish folk, especially the young people, and the number of them that have smartphones is indeed increasing. So they're not completely immune. With a smartphone, you can access all of the garbage as well as the good. Also, I think an important influence among Amish comes from their drivers. They don't own cars, so they hire drivers. Some of these drivers are full of this kind of material, eager to share it with their Amish friends.
I recently saw an article by a woman who had been an evangelical Christian. She finally left that church and became a Buddhist for a while. And then she decided to look at her Christian religious upbringing again. And she said, after not having been a practicing Christian for more than a decade, I started to attend a Mennonite church my husband had found and was delighted to discover a group of people committed to living out of deep compassion rather than rigid rules. The inclusive God language the congregation used also helped. I think the Mennonite church, some forms of the Mennonite church, has a real place to play in our church life.
Thank you, Joanne. Inasmuch as John and Marty Bender have been in England for quite a number of months, and attached to a very attractive Anglican church there. I'd invite your thoughts about how this looks from a British Isles experience. Please come up.
I would say that in our little section of England, the church is definitely losing attenders. We attend a very small congregation. They are very passionate about what they believe in. I don't see them as Christian nationalists. Although there is Brexit, which happened basically, I guess, because of the fear of people from other countries coming in.
Your experience of being in the British Isles in relation to the topic here of church attendance and practice and the like.
And the vicar at our church, St. Anton All Saints, is actually from South Africa. And so he has a very broad background and very broad interests and brings that to the congregation so that it's not so insular as some congregations might be.
We don't see young people, although there's a few young people who attend regularly. And one couple comes from a distance because they were married in the church and their child was dedicated in the church. We were at a festival, an annual church feast at another congregation close by, where the bishop was preaching. And his sermon was based on the prodigal son. And his point was that the Father represented God. Everyone is welcome. And the love of the Father is the love of God. Everyone is welcome at the table, at the feast. Afterwards, I took my camera and I recorded a 1 minute and 4 seconds interview with him. And my question to him was, how would you explain the welcome to an 11-year-old? That everyone is welcome at the feast. And he said, his first response was joyfully. And then he went on to say, yes, with the technical things, the parents would have to give permission for a child, an 11-year-old, to be part of the Eucharist and the larger meaning of what that is. But that was a thought-provoking message that he had.
This morning we got up early to join the 11 o'clock service at St. Anton, which is 6 o'clock here. And they did have a baptism of 2 babies that was happening this morning, but it's unlikely that that family will be coming to church. But baptism is still important in the tradition.
That's indeed a helpful observation. Tom, were you in any way able to see the live stream of College Mennonite this morning, or perhaps you went to another church?
No, I did not. Sorry.
Well, one of the things we had this morning was an outstanding testimony of a young man who has, for 5 or 6 years, been fighting cancer and has gone through all kinds of painful surgeries and recovery. And he stood in front of our congregation, praising God with gestures and wisdom far beyond his years, telling us how we need to have faith in God's care and power. And if there's hope that I have for the future, it's that we have more Caleb's and their capacity to express their faith. I thank you, Tom. Do you have any other concluding thoughts or observations to share with us?
No, it's been good to be with you.
Well, we thank you for an excellent summary of some factual, uncomfortable facts that we need to somehow be aware of and come to grips with. We thank you so much for your good research, and let's express our thanks. I think in light of the sobering situation that's described by our guest speaker, Tom Myers, I'd like to end with a brief prayer, if we'd like. Lord of our church, we thank you for those who faithfully transmitted to us the story of Jesus, the story of Jesus' followers, and the expectations that you have for how to follow. We pray for those who have lost their way. We pray for the young people among us who are questioning. And we ask that you would give us the grace and the wisdom to be good examples of faithful belief. In Jesus' name, amen.